Imagine waking up to a sky that has forgotten the sun. For weeks, rain has not stopped. The wheat in the fields is black. The bread in your home is gone. Your neighbor, a strong man last summer, now weighs less than his own child. And somewhere in the next village, a mother is doing something no mother should ever do, just to keep her other children alive. This is not a nightmare. This is a Tuesday in the year 1316. The Middle Ages are often remembered for cathedrals, knights, and stained glass. But behind that beautiful curtain is 1,000 years of horror the history books quietly skip over. Plagues that emptied entire cities in a single summer. Floods that swallowed 60 villages in a single night. Massacres so efficient, the killers ran out of victims before they ran out of blades. You are about to walk through the 10 most horrifying events documented in medieval Europe. Real dates, real numbers, real chronicles written by people who were still shaking when they picked up the pen. Some of these you may have heard of. Most of them you have not. And by the end, you will understand why. For the people who lived through them, the end of the world was never a metaphor. It was a calendar. Welcome to Medieval Secrets Unlocked. The foundation. Before we open the first door, you need to understand something. The medieval world was not simply cruel. It was fragile. Europe between the 5th and 15th century was a continent of maybe 70 million people, stretched thin across forests, muddy roads, and walled towns that had never seen a doctor with clean hands. Almost everyone lived within one bad harvest of starvation. Almost everyone lived within one hostile army of extinction. There was no antibiotic. There was no ambulance. There was no phone to call for help when your neighbor was on fire. And the horrors we are about to walk through did not arrive politely, one at a time. They stacked on top of each other. Famine weakened the population. Weakness invited plague. Plague collapsed the workforce. Collapse triggered rebellion. Rebellion invited massacre. And under all, the climate itself was shifting because between roughly 1300 and 1450, Europe entered what scientists now call the beginning of the Little Ice Age. Summers grew shorter. Winters grew longer. Rivers that had never frozen froze solid. Chronicles from monasteries across France, England, Germany, and Italy record this collapse in trembling ink. Monks who had spent their lives copying prayers suddenly found themselves recording the end of the world. One English chronicler wrote, simply, that in his village the living were not able to bury the dead, and the dead lay in the streets, and the dogs would not touch them. The events you are about to hear are not legends. Each one has a date, a location, and a body count. And here is the part that should disturb you most. These 10 events all happened within roughly 350 years of each other. Meaning, if you had lived a normal medieval lifespan of 40 years in the wrong place at the wrong time, you could have survived 3 of them, or died in the first. Let's open the first door. The first horror, when the rain would not stop. The first horror begins with something ordinary. Zen. In the spring of 1315, the skies over northern Europe opened, and they did not close again for months. Fields flooded. Grain rotted in the stalk. They could not be dried. Salt, which everyone needed to preserve meat, could not be evaporated from seawater because the sun refused to come out. By autumn, prices for a single loaf of bread had multiplied by 5, then by 10. By winter, in some towns, by 20. This is the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. And it is worse than most people realize. Historians estimate that between 5 and 12% of the population of Northern Europe died. In some towns, death climbed as high as 10 to 15%. Millions of people gone. Not to war, not to disease, to empty plates. But hunger does not simply kill you. It changes you. Contemporary chronicles from Flanders, England, and Germany record parents abandoning children on church steps, children begging for the crumbs off the shoes of travelers. And in the darkest records, kept by chroniclers like the Franciscan writer of the Chronicle of Salembin, and later monastic sources from the Low Countries, There are grim references to cannibalism, infanticide, and criminal gangs digging up freshly buried corpses. Imagine the smell. Wet earth. Vetvool. Wet bread turning green on the table before you can finish it. Imagine walking to church and stepping over the body of a neighbor you spoke to yesterday, who simply laid down in the mud and stopped. There's a chilling line in one English chronicle. It says the poor ate the dogs, and the dogs ate the poor. That was 2 years of the 14th century. 2 years. And here is the part that should make your skin crawl. This famine did not just kill people. It weakened an entire continent. Bones grew softer. Immune systems collapsed. A generation of children grew up malnourished. So when something worse arrived, 30 years later, Europe was already on its knees. And that something worse is coming next. The second horror, the ships that should have been turned away. October 1347. A small fleet of Genoese trading galleys drifts into the harbor of Messina in Sicily. From a distance, the ships look normal. Then the wind changes, and the whole port smells like something has died inside those hulls. Because something has. Almost every sailor aboard. The dockworkers who boarded first found men with black swellings under their arms and along their necks, the size of eggs, some the size of apples. Men coughing blood. Men with fingers turning black at the tips, as if dipped in ink, and running along the ropes, along the ballast. Into the streets of Messina, the true passengers of these ships were arriving. Rats. And on those rats, fleas. And in those fleas, a bacterium the medieval world had no name for. We call it Yersinia pestis. This is the Black Death. And no number in this script is more terrifying. Between 1347 and 1352, in 5 short years, the Black Death killed between 25 and 50 million Europeans. Some regions lost 30% of their population. Some lost 60. Some, according to modern researchers like Old Benedicto, may have lost as much as 70 or 80% locally. Florence, Paris, Avignon, London, Cairo. Great cities emptied in weeks. The Italian writer Boccaccio, who lived through the plague in Florence, wrote in the introduction to his Decameron that so many bodies arrived at the churches that trenches were dug, and the corpses were stacked in layers, with a thin sprinkle of earth between each layer. Quote, like lasagna. Let that image sit with you for a moment. There were 3 forms of the disease. The bubonic form, which killed 30 to 60% of those infected. The pneumonic form, which attacked the lungs and killed almost everyone within 3 days. And the septicemic form, which entered the bloodstream and killed you before sundown. You would wake up healthy, feel a headache at noon, notice a swelling by dinner, and be dead before the priest arrived. Doctors, following the ancient Greek physician Galen, blamed bad air. They lit fires. They rang church bells. They organized religious processions that packed thousands of people together, which of course did nothing except help the plague spread faster. And the plague was not finished. It came back. Again in the 1360s. Again in the 1370s. It kept returning, wave after wave, for nearly 300 years. But even the plague was not the worst thing Europe did to itself during those years. Because when the sickness could not be explained, someone had to be blamed. The third horror, the fires of Strasbourg. While the plague was still burning through the Rhineland, on the 14th of February 1349, in the free city of Strasbourg, something happened that stains the history of Europe forever. A wooden platform was built in the Jewish cemetery. And on that platform, roughly 2,000 Jewish men, women, and children were burned alive. Not in battle, not in war, in a coordinated, planned, publicly organized civic murder. The excuse was madness. Rumors had spread that Jewish communities had poisoned the wells of Europe and caused the plague. Pope Clement VI from Avignon actually issued 2 papal bulls in 1348 declaring the Jews innocent, pointing out that Jews were dying of the plague at the same rate as everyone else. Almost nobody listened. Between 1348 and 1351, More than 200 Jewish communities across the Holy Roman Empire, France, Spain, and the Low Countries were destroyed. Basel, Freiburg, Cologne, Mainz, Nuremberg, Erfurt. In some towns, Jews were locked inside their synagogues, and the buildings were set on fire. And here is the darkest detail most people do not know. Many of these massacres were not sudden explosions of panic. They were planned in advance. Records from Strasbourg show that the massacre was scheduled before the plague even arrived in the city. Because behind the religious hysteria was something colder. Money. Many Christian townspeople and nobles owed enormous debts to Jewish moneylenders, and burning the lenders erased the debts. Fear was the mask. Greed was the face underneath. Imagine standing in a square on a cold February morning, watching your neighbors pile firewood around people you have lived beside for generations. Imagine the smell of pine and smoke and something else, and a city council writing the whole event down in its account books, calmly, like a business transaction. That is not the Middle Ages of the storybooks. That is the Middle Ages of the archives. And while Europe was burning its own people, from the east, a shadow had already arrived 100 years earlier, that had almost ended everything. The fourth horror, the riders from the east. Before the plague, before the famine, in the spring of 1241, something worse than any disease crossed into Europe on horseback. The Mongols. By this point, the Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan and his successors had already destroyed most of the known world. Now, a force of roughly 20,000 riders under the general Subutai and the princes Badu in order to turn their eyes west. Their scouts moved faster than any European messenger. Their bows shot further than any European crossbow. And their strategy was something European knights had literally never seen before. On the 9th of April 1241, at the Battle of Legnica in what is now Poland, a European army of Polish knights, German soldiers, and Knights Templar met a smaller Mongol force. Chroniclers, including the Polish historian Jan Długas writing over a century later using earlier sources, describe the outcome. The Mongols pretended to retreat. The Europeans charged. The Mongols turned in the saddle, fired arrows behind them, and destroyed the entire army in a single afternoon. The Mongols then, according to chroniclers, cut off one ear from every dead European. 9 sacks of ears were reportedly sent back to their commander as a body count. 2 days later, on the 11th of April, in Hungary at the Battle of Mohi, an even larger European army was annihilated. Hungarian chroniclers estimated that up to half the population of the kingdom died in the year that followed, from combat, from starvation, and from the systematic destruction of villages. Hungarian chroniclers estimated that up to half the population of the kingdom died in the year that followed, from combat. Hungarian chroniclers estimated that up to half the population of the kingdom died in the year that followed, from starvation. Hungarian chroniclers estimated that up to half the population of the kingdom died in the year that followed, and from the systematic destruction of villages. The Mongols burned everything. Chronicles from monasteries in Hungary describe roads lined with skulls, rivers choked with bodies. Entire regions of Central Europe simply disappeared from the tax records for a generation. Europe was saved not by any army, but by a coincidence. Late in 1241, the great Khan Ogedai died in far-off Karakorum, and the Mongol princes had to turn back east to elect his successor. They never returned in force. But for the people who lived through 1241, there was no relief. Just silence. A silence full of ash. And speaking of ash, our next horror begins with a fire that a pope himself ordered lit. The fifth horror, the city that was told to kill everyone. On the 22nd of July, 1209, the crusading army of the Catholic Church stood outside the walls of Béziers, a wealthy town in southern France. Their target was a Christian sect the church had declared heretical, called the Cathars. The problem was most of the people inside Béziers were not Cathars. They were ordinary Catholics who simply refused to hand over their neighbors. According to a letter later written by the papal legate Arnaud Amalric to Pope Innocent III, when a crusading knight asked how to tell the Catholics from the heretics inside the city, the legate is said to have replied with one of the most chilling lines in all of medieval history: "Kill them all. God will know his own." Whether he used those exact words is debated, but what happened next is not. The Crusaders broke into the city and slaughtered the entire population: men, women, children, people sheltering inside the churches. The chronicler Caesarius of Heisterbach, writing not long after, put the number of dead at nearly 20,000. Modern historians think the figure was lower, but still catastrophic. Perhaps 7 to 15,000 people in a single day. The town was then burned to the ground. This was the opening act of the Albigensian Crusade, a war that would last 20 years, from 1209 to 1229, and effectively erase the entire Cathar civilization of southern France. Their language, Occitan, was suppressed. Their culture, one of the most tolerant in medieval Europe, was flattened. Their last stronghold, the mountain fortress of Massacre, fell in 1244, and over 200 Cathars were burned alive at its base for refusing to convert. Imagine standing on the walls of Béziers that morning, watching an army you cannot fight approach a gate you cannot hold, knowing there is no negotiation. No se render. No merci. Because mercy was never on the table. The horror of Béziers is not just the death count. It is the paperwork. Somewhere, in some monastery, a clerk sat down that evening and calmly wrote the numbers into a ledger. That was the church at war with its own people. But the church at war with its enemies could be worse. And in 1204, only 5 years before Béziers, an army of Christian crusaders had done something so shocking that even the Pope who launched the crusade condemned it. The sixth horror, the betrayal of Constantinople. The Fourth Crusade was supposed to reach Jerusalem. It never got close. Instead, in April 1204, after months of political manipulation, unpaid Venetian debts, and broken promises, a Western crusading army stood outside the walls of Constantinople, the greatest Christian city in the world, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, a city of golden domes and libraries and marble streets that made Paris and London look like villages. On the 12th of April, the Crusaders broke through the sea walls, and for 3 days they did to their fellow Christians what they had sworn to do to Muslims in the Holy Land. Contemporary Byzantine writers, particularly the historian Nicetas Choniates, who lived through the sack and lost everything he owned, describe scenes that are almost unreadable. Nuns dragged from convents and assaulted in the streets. Priests murdered on their own altars. Ancient bronze statues of horses, of emperors, of gods, melted down for coins. The great church of Hagia Sophia, the largest cathedral in the Christian world, was stripped of its silver, its gold, and its holy relics. And in one of the most infamous moments of medieval history, a prostitute was reportedly seated on the patriarch's throne inside Hagia Sophia, singing crude songs, while drunken crusaders danced around her. Pope Innocent III, when he heard what had happened, wrote to his own crusaders in fury. He accused them of turning their swords against Christians and staining themselves with the blood of the innocent. The city never fully recovered. The Byzantine Empire, weakened forever, would fall to the Ottoman Turks 249 years later, in 1453. Some historians argue that the fall of Constantinople in 1453 actually began in April 1204, because when Christians sack Christians, no walls stay standing forever. And speaking of walls, our next horror is about walls that could not stop water. The seventh horror, the night the SEA came inland. On the 16th of January 1362, the North Sea turned against Europe. A massive storm surge, driven by hurricane-force winds, tore into the coasts of what are now the Netherlands, Germany, Denmark, and England. Chroniclers called it Groot Mandrank, the great drowning of men. The church calendar called it St. Marcellus's flood. Contemporary estimates put the death toll at a minimum of 25,000. Some sources push it as high as 50,000, and a few chronicles claim numbers as high as 100,000, though modern historians view the higher figures with caution. Whole towns simply vanished. The wealthy Frisian trading town of Rungholt, sometimes called the Atlantis of the North Sea, was swallowed in a single night. Its church bells reportedly still audible under low tide for years afterward. According to local legend, archaeologists in the 21st century have actually discovered the ruins of Rungholt buried in the tidal flats, confirming that the drowned city was real. The flood carved out a huge new bay, the Jade Bay in Germany, that had not existed before. It redrew the entire coastline of northern Europe. Imagine the sound. The whole ocean, rising in the dark, walking inland while your family sleeps. Wooden houses collapsing. Cattle screaming as barns fill with black water. Children carried away by currents that used to be streets. And the survivors, in the morning, walking out onto what had once been their fields. Nothing left. No landmarks. No naves. Just wet sand and salt and a horizon that was suddenly closer than it had ever been. The people of the North Sea coast had lived with floods for centuries. But this one was different. It was so vast that peat cutting, land drainage, and coastal reclamation, all normal medieval activities, had left the land dangerously exposed. In other words, human beings had helped make the disaster worse. Somewhere, that story feels familiar, because human beings, when pushed too far, tend to strike back at the world around them. And in medieval France, in the summer of 1358, they did. The eighth horror, when the peasants burned the castles. By 1358, France was broken. The 100 Years' War with England was going terribly. The King of France, John II, had been captured by the English at the Battle of Poitiers 2 years earlier and was being held for a colossal ransom. The countryside was being systematically destroyed by English raiding parties, called chevauchés, which burned villages, killed peasants, and stole everything not nailed down. And the French nobility, whose one job was to protect the peasants, was not just failing. It was demanding higher taxes to fund its own ransom. The peasants finally snapped. In late May 1358, in the region north of Paris, thousands of peasants rose up in what became known as the Jacquerie, named mockingly after the common name Jacques. Contemporary chroniclers, especially Jean Froissart, describe what happened next with horror. Peasants stormed castles. They killed noble families. In some infamous cases, they reportedly forced noble women to watch the deaths of their husbands and children before killing them too. But the peasants had no army, no leadership beyond a farmer named Guillaume Cail. And when the nobility organized its counterattack, led by Charles the Bad of Navarre, the response was devastating. At the Battle of Mello on the 10th of June 1358, Guillaume Cail was tricked into a parley, captured, tortured, and, according to some accounts, crowned with a red-hot iron crown before being executed. The peasant army was crushed. Then came the reprisals. In the weeks that followed, contemporary estimates suggest that up to 20,000 peasants were massacred across northern France. Entire villages were exterminated as punishment. The nobility rode through the countryside for months, killing anyone even suspected of having joined a revolt. The rebellion had lasted about 2 weeks. The reprisals lasted the rest of the summer. And the horror of the Jacquerie is not just the death count. It is what it revealed. That the medieval social order, the beautiful hierarchy of king, noble, and peasant that fills every romantic history book, was held together by nothing but violence. Take the violence away, and the whole thing collapsed in 14 days. 23 years later, across the English Channel, the exact same lesson would be taught again. The ninth horror, the boy king and the broken promise. In June 1381, in England, tens of thousands of peasants marched on London. They were furious about the poll tax, a flat tax that hit the poor far harder than the rich. They were furious about the wages they were still not being paid, more than 30 years after the Black Death had made their labor precious. And they were furious about a rigid legal system still trying to keep them tied to the land like their grandparents had been. Their leaders were a former soldier named Tyler and a radical preacher named John Ball, who famously asked, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? For 3 days, the peasants held London. They burned the palace of the king's uncle. They executed the Archbishop of Canterbury and the king's treasurer on Tower Hill. They marched into the Tower of London itself, one of the only times in its history it was ever breached. Then, on the 15th of June 1381, the 14-year-old King Richard II rode out to meet the rebels at Smithfield. What happened next is disputed, but most accounts agree that Tyler was stabbed to death by the mayor of London during the negotiation. The king, showing extraordinary nerve for a teenager, rode toward the shocked rebels and shouted that he would be their new leader and that they should follow him. They did. And then he betrayed them. By November 1381, over 1,500 rebels had been rounded up and executed. John Ball was hanged, drawn, and quartered. Every promise the boy king had made in the field was revoked. When challenged, Richard II reportedly said, quote, "Villains ye are, and villains ye shall remain." The horror of 1381 is not just the executions. It is the pattern. Every time the medieval poor rose up, they lost. Every time. And every time, the response was the same. Public torture. Mass hanging. Bodies left rotting on gibbets as a warning. And that pattern of punishment is exactly what would fuel our final horror. A horror that stretched not for weeks or months, but for centuries. The 10th horror, the burning times. The last horror on our list is not a single event. It is a wave that lasted 300 years. Between roughly 1450 and 1750, in the twilight of the medieval world and the dawn of the early modern one, Europe went mad. Modern historians estimate that between 40,000 and 60,000 people were executed for the imagined crime of witchcraft. Roughly 75 to 80% of them were women. Most people think witch hunts belonged to the deep Middle Ages. They did not. The medieval church was actually quite skeptical about witchcraft for most of its history. It was only in the 15th century, especially after the publication of a terrible book called the Malleus Maleficarum in 1487 by the German inquisitor Heinrich Kramer, that witch trials exploded across Europe. Widows, herbalists, midwives, elderly women who lived alone, women who had land that a male neighbor wanted, women who had argued with the wrong priest. The methods were sickening. Confessions were extracted under torture and then used to justify further torture. Family members were forced to testify. Children were sometimes executed alongside their mothers. The great irony of the witch hunts is this. They were not the product of medieval superstition. They were the product of the printing press, of religious wars between Protestants and Catholics, and of new legal systems that made torture routine. In other words, the witch hunts were, in many ways, a very modern horror wearing a medieval costume. Some regions of Europe went almost untouched. Others were devastated. In parts of Germany, especially during the 16th and 17th centuries, whole villages lost dozens of women in a single decade. And the last legal execution for witchcraft in Europe happened in Switzerland in 1782. Not the Middle Ages at all. The age of Mozart. That is how long the burning times lasted. From the days of knights to the days of pianos. The philosophical synthesis. So what do we do with all of this? 10 horrors. 500 years. Tens of millions of lives. And these are only the 10 we chose. We could have talked about the sweating sickness, the sack of Rome in 1084, the Wendyish Crusades, the famine of 1005. There are so many more that we did not have time to open. Here is the uncomfortable truth. When you actually read the medieval chronicles, when you sit with the ink of monks who watched their monasteries burn, you realize that the Middle Ages were not a distant, dark, foreign country. They were in almost every horror we discussed, the result of ordinary human beings making very ordinary decisions. Greed decided who lived in Strasbourg. Bureaucracy decided who died at Béziers. Politics decided who starved during the Great Famine. Because grain existed, but the roads were unsafe and the markets were broken. Fear decided who was accused of witchcraft. Pride decided who charged at Legnica. None of these forces are medieval. They are human. And that is why these stories still matter. Every time a modern society decides that a minority is responsible for a disease, we are Strasbourg again. Every time a war promises to be short and clean and honorable and turns out to be neither, we are the Fourth Crusade again. Every time a natural disaster is made worse by decisions that were made decades earlier, we are the Grote Man drink again. The Middle Ages did not end because people became wiser. They ended because the tools changed. But the human beings holding the tools are still, mostly, the same. There is a line, attributed to the historian Barbara Tuchman, that once you have read enough about the 14th century, the 20th century starts to feel very familiar. She was not wrong. The final truth in CTA. If you have made it this far, thank you. Genuinely. You have just walked through 500 years of horror in half an hour. The point of video like this is not to make you feel lucky to live in the modern world. The point is to make you feel connected to the people who lived through these events. Because they were not statistics. They were not paintings. They were human beings with names, and children, and jokes, and favorite foods, and small hopes for spring. And they deserve to be remembered honestly, not romantically, not as villains, not as victims, as people. If this journey moved you, or shocked you, or made you see the past a little differently, do us one small favor. Subscribe to Medieval Secrets Unlocked. Every subscriber helps us dig deeper into archives, chronicles, and forgotten records to bring you the stories the schoolbooks skipped. And in the comments below, we want to hear from you. Of these 10 horrors, which one disturbed you the most? The famine that quietly killed millions? The plague that emptied the cities? The night the sea walked inland? Or the fires of Strasbourg that were never really about the plague at all? Tell us. Because the more we talk about these stories, the harder it becomes to repeat them. Ring the bell for the next video. Share this one with someone who loves history. And remember one simple thing. The past is not gone. It is just waiting to see if we were paying attention. Historical note. This video is based on documented medieval and early modern chronicles, modern academic research, including works by Ole Benedicto, Barbara Tuchman, John Aberth, and Norman Cohn, and archaeological findings from the last century. Some numbers, especially death tolls, remain disputed by historians and are noted where relevant. The events described are educational in nature. They are shared to honor the people who lived through them, not to sensationalize their suffering. History remembered honestly is history less likely to repeat.